Anywhere you go, you belong. Anywhere you say, anywhere.
The Silverstone Permafrost PF240W-ARGB is the latest addition to the lineup of closed-loop liquid CPU coolers from the Permafrost series of Silverstone. This cooler is using a standard 240mm radiator and a pump-on CPU block design for the liquid loop. However, the main feature of this cooler, apart from its performance, is the addressable RGB integration, which is plentiful both on the cooler and on the included fans. The model featured in this review is different, as it is the brand new all-white variant of the Permafrost PF240 cooler, which sports, you guess it, an all-white matte coating on everything apart from the base plate and the mounting system. This coating is evenly applied on everything and has a great build quality, as having a white coating, especially on the fins of the radiator, can be difficult to achieve. The Permafrost 240 uses two 120mm fans which have the model number APA1225H12. However, these fans are identical in design with the Silverstone Airblazer 120RW fans. Thus, we can safely assume that these fans are part of the Airblazer series. In fact, at closer inspection, it appears that the model numbers are pretty close. Anyway, these fans are all white, obviously, and have a minimum speed of 600 RPM and a maximum speed of 2200 RPM. Other features included with these fans are the rubber pads placed on both sides of the corners to dampen the vibrations, the impellers, which are designed to both look good and also to generate a good amount of static pressure, and of course, the integration of addressable RGB LEDs, which go really well with this all-white coating of the fans and the cooler. The cooler has a standard 240mm radiator made from aluminum and copper. On the side where the tubes are inserted into the radiator, there is a small plastic-made fill port which is sealed from the factory. While there is no warranty label that will prevent you from opening this fill port and using it for air bleeding or filling up the cooler, this will most likely be at your own risk, as no company that sells self-contained coolers will back up a unit that has been tampered with. In addition, this radiator has a fin per inch density of 20, which is pretty much the same for more or less all these radiators. The two tubes used by this cooler have a total length of around 400mm and are covered by high-quality synthetic sleeving. Unfortunately, this 400mm length is just enough to be in between two situations, A being too short and B being too long. 400mm is just enough to make the installation a hassle, especially if you want to install the radiator at the top of your case. And if you want to install the radiator at the front, well, good luck with that, because it will only happen if you have a narrow case. The tubes connect to the CPU block and pump assembly of the cooler using two right-angle plastic-made fittings which thankfully can be rotated. The CPU block and pump assembly follow the same design as the rest of the cooler, and by this I mean that they are the same color and have some RGB integration. The CPU block has a height of just 50mm and has a perfectly square footprint within the CPU socket area, which means that it will work in any orientation you decide to use for your system. The RGB integration of the CPU block is in the shape of the Silverstone snowflake logo. The front plate of the block is highly reflective and will cover up the snowflake logo if the RGB LEDs are not powered on. The base plate of the cooler is made from solid copper and has a smooth surface, with no imperfections and barely any marks left from the manufacturing process. The copper plate is attached to the pump assembly by 8 star or torque screws. The power cable of the CPU block is plenty long to reach any fan power header on your motherboard. However, the addressable RGB cable is not that good, as in it is not long enough to be routed around the back of the motherboard and towards the lower part of your system, which is where usually the RGB headers are found on any modern motherboard. This is a tragic oversight to what it is so far a really good design. The accessories included with this cooler are plentiful. You get some 3-pin addressable RGB cables and a dedicated addressable RGB controller for the LEDs. Then there is a small tube of thermal compound, a Y-type fan splitter and a Molex power adapter. Finally, there are the components of the mounting system, which includes a metallic backplate, 4 spring-loaded nuts, metal studs, long fan screws, short radiator screws, plastic spacers and other mounting clips and brackets. The installation of the cooler is fairly simple. First, you take the backplate and insert the studs into the correct slots of the plate itself. Then on the opposite side, you secure the said studs with these round plastic spacers. Afterwards, the backplate is installed at the back of the cooler, and then at the front of the CPU socket, you place these large plastic spacers. Finally, you place the thermal compound on the CPU surface, and then the CPU block is attached over the studs. You then secure the CPU block in place with the help of the before mentioned 4 spring-loaded nuts. Finally, the radiator and the fans are installed in your desired locations inside your system, and you connect everything together. More on the cables of this cooler at the end of this review. Before we head into the testing and performance segment of this review, we need to hear how this cooler sounds like, and this means both the cooler as a whole unit and also the pump noise alone. And we start with the pump noise, which is powered on from a direct power source and thus runs at its maximum speed of 3400 RPM. Moving on with the whole cooler, which will have its fans stopped or spinning at the lowest speeds and then rising their RPM to the maximum possible of 2200 RPM. And the cooler sounds a bit like this. The maximum sound value reached by the Silverstone Permafrost 240 with both fans spinning at their maximum speed is 44 decibels, with the measuring device placed at the standard distance of 10 cm away from the system and the CPU cooler itself. The system used for testing the cooling performance of all CPU coolers, unless otherwise stated, is using an Intel i9 9900K running at both the factory settings and frequency, and then afterwards overclocked manually to 5 GHz on all cores with a core voltage of 1.261 volts. The testing procedure uses 2 main benchmarks, and we start with the Intel Burn Test V2 benchmark, which provides a CPU load that is close to what you will encounter in modern AAA video games and video editing. And in this test, the Silverstone Permafrost 240 reached a maximum temperature of 57 degrees Celsius, with the ambient temperature at 26 degrees Celsius. Not bad, and the cooler is right next to the Fractal Design Celsius S24 Prisma. However, the next test comes next, and this one uses the FPU stability test found within the AIDA 64 Extreme software. This benchmark places an unrealistically high load on the CPU itself, something which will be encountered rarely if ever in your daily usage. In fact, the CPU load that will be close to this benchmark is heavy video rendering. And in this test, the Silverstone Permafrost 240 reached a maximum temperature of 83 degrees Celsius with the same ambient temperature of 26 degrees Celsius. The Silverstone Permafrost PF240W-ARGB is a pretty long name. However, this is a really good closed-loop CPU cooler. The build quality is great, and this is highlighted especially on this white model, where everything looks fantastic, and the weight coating has the same color shade on everything, regardless of the materials used. The cooling performance is really good, and it is on the same level with coolers such as the Fractal Design Celsius S24 Prisma or the Noctua NH-D15. while being on average more affordable than your regular addressable RGB liquid cooler. This particular cooler, in fact, is one of the cheapest addressable RGB liquid cooler on the market right now. The noise output is nothing to write home about, and it is to be expected as you have two 120mm fans that will spin up to 2200 RPM, which is not exactly a slow speed by any means. The only bad thing about this cooler is the sheer number of cables and things you need to connect, and if you're not careful, it will turn into a giant mess into your system. And to add insult to injury, the RGB cable of the CPU block is not long enough to be able to be routed properly around the back of the motherboard, which means that you will either be forced to make a mess at the front of your motherboard, use the included RGB controller, or just not use it at all. Then the fan themselves have the same situation, with 2 long cables per fan, with multiple headers and splitters. This issue is not just with this cooler or with Silverstone RGB products, it is everywhere, and it appears that everyone has accepted it as the norm. Well, it shouldn't be. Many of these cables could have been hidden by being routed on the underside of the sleeving of the tubes of the cooler, a thing which some coolers do have, but those are more expensive. The second issue is the length of the tubes. At 400mm, these are both too short to have the radiator installed at the front of the case, and also too long to create issues if you decide to install the radiator at the top of the case. While in my case the cooler did fit at the top, those tubes are banged in too much for my liking, but so far so good. However, all these being said, the Silverstone Permafrost PF240W-ARGB is a great CPU cooler that will fit any gaming system you can imagine. In fact, this cooler will replace my previous liquid cooler in my main tasting system. Not only because the white coating matches my case, but also because this cooler is just so good overall and is using a silent pump, which is a rare thing these days. There is also no useless RGB software to be seen, and the mounting system is pretty good as well. If you like this review, then you might consider subscribing for more, and also if you want to support the channel in a direct way, then in the description below you can find both the Patreon and the subscriber star pages of the channel.